Hola, buenos dias. I have prepared a little something to say to you, but I don't want to mess it up. So I'm just going to read it from my phone and look like a total loser, but nonetheless. Estoy muy contenta de estar acá con ustedes. ¿Ustedes? Yes? Thank you. Such a privilege to be here with you today, and such an honor to talk with you about something that is changing practice around the globe, which is John Hattie's research and the work of visible learning. And as we continue to learn together today and spend our time together, I wanted to put up my Twitter handle as well as my email address to all of you. So if there is any learning that you have going on today and you tweet it out, I promise you I will look at all tweets and reply to anything that's out there. I will also return any emails with any questions or need for resources or requests that you may have. So I'll give you a second to take that down as I see you doing so. All right, so today we just heard from James that challenge is interesting. And in James' context, he was talking primarily about challenging students, which we could all get behind, and we could all say without a shadow of a doubt, yes, I believe in challenging students. Students need to work hard, they need to take the path that is more interesting, and I am ready to set them on that journey. And then when it comes to ourselves, as adults, and we think about challenge being interesting, or we think about embracing difficulty, maybe throwing ourselves in the adult learning pit isn't as cool as putting students in the pit. It's a lot easier to put our learners in the pit than it is to put ourselves in there. And today, I'm going to throw you right into the adult learning pit. And James set us up beautifully for that, which is, if you do not have some sort of cognitive dissonance as a result of the research that I'm about to share with you, something may be wrong. Because what's going to happen today is you are going to look at your beliefs, your myths, your feelings about teaching, learning, and leadership, and you're going to match that with what the research is saying about the impact or the effectiveness of such practices. So who's ready to jump into the pit and really live Challenge is Interesting? Okay, so 5 of you. Excellent. The rest of you, feel free to leave if you need to. So here's our learning intention today. This is the destination that we're headed to, and I have no doubt all of you will be able to understand some of the key messages within the visible learning research. And if we are successful, we will have hit these criteria. Very clear, very simple, be able to articulate some of those key findings, but most importantly, identify how do these findings fit within your practice back at your setting. And so with that, I want to introduce you to Professor John Hattie. And I think James' picture of John is much more interesting than this one. But John Hattie was motivated to start a collection of research because he was driven by the concept, why is it that everything we do in teaching, learning, and leadership seems to work? And why is it that we're in the only profession that thinks everything we do works and works equally well? I mean, if you think about it, there are very few other professions that have this mentality that if I adopt this practice, or if I put this in place, it'll all work and it will all do good for people. For example, a doctor. If you have a problem with your foot and you go to a doctor and he treats you the way he would a heart patient, that probably wouldn't make much sense, would it? Or if you were going to get a divorce, and so you went to an attorney to get a divorce, and you ended up with an attorney who defends murderers, that probably wouldn't suit you so much. Well, unless, of course, your divorce was bitter, and then that's a totally different story, right? But in our field, we have this notion that if we buy this program, if we adopt this curriculum, if we try this and do this, all of it should work and all of it should work equally well. Now, it's all based out of really good intentions, right? Every single person in this room will do whatever it takes to make learning stick for kids and to raise student achievement. You all have incredibly good hearts, you are all incredibly passionate, and so you will make anything work. But the question shouldn't ever be, does it all work? And I can make anything work, but it should be what works best. So John Hattie really, he's done his own research, but really what he is a collector. And not really just even a collector, John is pretty much a hoarder. He would go on one of those TV shows where you have to clean out your collection because it's so massive, right? Some of you maybe collect china. John Hattie happens to collect research. Turn and tell one of your neighbors sitting next to you, what is something that you collect? And wrap it up in 3, 2, and 1. It's usually incredibly hard to get an audience back together after people share what they collect. Because I'm guessing you found out something incredibly interesting about the person sitting next to you just now. Well, some of you have very interesting collections. John's collection was driven by the purpose of determining what works best. So he decided to collect research and research studies to determine what works best, initially on 150 practices that we adopt in teaching, learning, and leadership. And this collection was intended to make sure that we are working on those items that really impact student learning for the best, because every teacher or every student deserves a great teacher, not by chance, but by design. And the best part of John Hattie's research is we no longer have to guess about what makes a good teacher. We no longer have to guess about what that design is because we're empowered with this information to do so. So when John decided to bring his collection of research studies to the world, he published a book called Visible Learning in 2009, which was a synthesis of over 800 meta-analysis, over 50,000 studies, over 250 million students studied worldwide. And it was all on 150 practices. The field knew no such collection of research at the time to help us understand the impact of the practices that we employ every single day. And so this research collection, at the time it came out, it did not take long for this book to become the top-selling academic book of all time. And the best thing about John is he continues to collect research. He collects it on the initial 150 practices that sit within that initial framework of 2009, but he continues to add more practices as research comes out and more studies. The best part of this whole narrative is the more research John adds, the more the story stays the same. What works in our field continues to work and has worked well for decades. And what kind of has an average effect continues to have an average effect. The more research, the more studies, the more the story stays the same. Now John is over 230 influences, over 75,000 studies, and over 500 million students studied around the world. It's an insane collection. And what he found in his initial research is 95% of everything that we do works. 95%. So there's no wonder why we think everything we do works, because 95% of 150 practices actually do work. But the question isn't, does it work? The question is, what works best? And because if I get in my car in the morning and I turn it on and it takes 4 times to rev the engine till I finally get it started, and black smoke sputters out the back, and I kind of chug my way out of the garage, and I get to my destination, I kind of wipe my brow and go, ooh, thank God I got to my destination. I don't know if I'm gonna get anywhere else, right? And what we need is to know that what we are doing works and works well all of the time. So we look at this evidence to avoid this type of decision making in our schools. And I can tell you honestly, I was there. I was that teacher, I was that school leader who tried everything I possibly could for groups of at-risk students. And at the end of the day, when they were taking their assessments, I stood with my fingers crossed behind my back, hoping and praying that something I did with them would stick and that they would raise their student achievement scores. But I never knew the impact of what I did and if it was effective or not. So what I'd like to invite you to do right now is I have put 6 of John's initial 150 practices on this slide. These are not the top 6 of the 150, they are not the bottom 6, and they are not the middle 6. You could be looking at number 3 and number 134. Okay? What I'm going to ask you to do by yourself or with a partner is attempt to power rank these in order of which do you think has the greatest impact on student achievement, to which do you think has not so hot of an impact on student achievement, in order 1 through 6. Go ahead and attempt to prioritize these. Now I'm going to give you 2 minutes to get all the answers right. On your marks, get set, go. Fifteen seconds remain. And wrap it up in 3, 2, and 1. All right, so who has all the answers? Anyone? All right, that's all right, because this is just learning, right? So here we go. I want to reveal the answers to you. Drum roll, please. Drum roll, please. All right, here we go. up here, please. I think for the purposes of the rest of our time together, since this research can be pretty interesting and make us want to have a lot of dialogue, I'm going to teach you something. I'm not sure if you've learned it before, but when I say the word waterfall, I'm going to ask you to do this. Psh, just like a waterfall, okay? So let's practice. Turn and tell your neighbor something that surprised you from this ranking of the research. Go. Waterfall? Beautiful. Excellent job. You shush yourself. I do not have to. All is good. So while this order is interesting because it lets us know that in comparison to these other 5 items, mobility is at the very bottom of this list. It lets us know that homework works a little bit better than ability grouping. But as far as impact, we don't really know much about the impact of these practices or what the story is behind this ranking. And so we need to know more. So therefore, John gathered his research, and he had one primary rule about the research he collected. And that is that research had to have an impact on student achievement. It had to have some sort of national or international assessment score tied to the research in order to be included in the study. And that was imperative and important to know because when you start looking at a lot of these effects, one of the typical things that teachers say is, well, doesn't John Hattie care about the mental impact of this practice on the student? Or doesn't John care about the teacher? And it's not a matter of caring. John is a very caring man. It's a matter of having a control for the study. And in this particular collection of research within visible learning, our control is, did it have an impact on student achievement? So he collected 3 types of data throughout his journey to illustrate this impact on student achievement. And all of the studies showed growth or difference over time. And all of this to say, what he did was he took all of the assessment scores on one particular practice that we implement, and he put them on a common scale. So if you look at this scale, for example, this scale could represent cooperative learning. Cooperative learning has a 0.41 effect in the research. Okay, so basically what he could have done is he could have taken all of the studies that are related to cooperative learning, put them on a scale, and worked to find the average effect. Using a method called Cohens D, he worked to determine what that average or typical effect was. And as James helps us understand this morning, the typical effect within this research is a 0.40. Now, we call this the hinge point in the research because it is the equivalent of approximately 1 year's growth over 1 year's time for students. Or what we like to say is our moral imperative, meaning every child in our care deserves at least 1 year's growth over 1 year's time. Many children that we work with need more than 1 year's growth over 1 year's time. But it is the typical effect in the research. And so it is true that with it being the standard deviation, if you were to double it and get a 0.80, that is the equivalent of approximately 2 years growth over 1 year time. A 1.2 effect is approximately 3 years growth over 1 year time. It's also true if you go the other way and you look at an effect of about a 0.20, that's about a half year's growth over a year's time. And so just like a Richter scale helps us understand the impact of an earthquake, this scale helps us understand the impact of the practices that we implement in our teaching practice. And another way to describe that is what we call this barometer of influence. And in this barometer of influence, you will see this in all of Hattie's books in relation to when he looks at one practice. Here is the effect size that he assigns and where it sits in this barometer. Now, we call the blue zone the zone of desired effects. That is where we want to be for every child, at least 1 year's growth over 1 year time. The green zone is anywhere from about a half year's growth over a year's time to less than a year's growth over a year's time. What label do you notice is given to the green zone? Typical teacher effects. What could that possibly mean? What do you think? So when John gathered the research, the typical teacher around the world, not teachers in Argentina, and certainly not teachers in this room, but the typical teacher around the world gets about a half year's growth over a year's time to a little less than a year's growth over a year's time for their learners. The yellow zone is even more disturbing than the typical teacher effects. That is called the developmental effects. If one of the 150 practices has an effect size that falls between a 0 and a 0.2, it is the equivalent of putting any person with a beating heart, not a certified teacher, but any person with a beating heart in the classroom teaching, because the learner will grow and mature that much anyway, no matter what initiative you are implementing if it falls in this zone. So that is developmental effects. And then we have reverse effects. And the good news is 95% of everything we do works. The bad news is 95% of everything we do works if your measurement is 0. If your measurement is a 0.4, there's about 57 of the 150 practices that actually work and get you into that effect. But with 95% of everything we do works above 0, the red zone, less than 5% of the research. And as John says, there's really very little that we do that actually harms children. So good news to all of you, we are not harming learners. But if you think about the order of effects that we had in those top 6, and you think about that barometer of influence, I want you to think about homework, okay? And if you were to go back to this barometer of influence, where do you think that homework sits within these zones? Do you think it's in the red zone? Assigning homework actually makes a child go backward over time? Do you think it's in the yellow zone, meaning it's the equivalent of a child will grow that much anyway, so it doesn't matter who their teacher is? Is it about a half year to a little less than a year's growth over a year's time? Or is it in that blue zone? Go ahead and turn and tell your neighbor, where do you think it goes? Waterfall. All right, so stand up if you think homework falls in the red zone. You think homework makes a child go backward over time. Go ahead and just stand up. No one? No one thinks it falls in the red zone. All right, what about the yellow zone? Homework is the equivalent of developmental effects. Go ahead and stand up if you think it falls in that zone. All right. Thank you, brave ones. I appreciate it. And if you think it falls in that green zone, a little less than a year's growth over a year's time, go ahead and stand up. The majority of you, okay. All right. Excellent. And if you are that homework proponent that can't get enough homework and loves the value of it, and you think it's in the blue zone, go ahead and stand up. Thank you for your honesty. So much thank you. All right, so what I'm going to do right now is I am going to share with you, now that you have a really good understanding of how to interpret effect sizes, I'm going to share with you the effect sizes of these 6 so you can further understand the impact of each of these practices. Who's ready to see the results? Anyone? Excellent. Well, for those of you who aren't, we're still going to look at them, okay? So I need another drum roll, please. And here they are. Waterfall. So assigning an effect size helps us understand a little bit more about the magnitude of certain practices that we implement. Were there any shockers to you on this list? Maybe not of what worked better than something else, but when you assign an effect size and you get a 1.44, I don't know about you, but in my mind I wonder, what is that? Approximately 3.5 years growth over a year's time. I want to know a little bit more about that. Or maybe if you look at ability grouping and you see that ability grouping has an effect size of a 0.12 and you know it's in that developmental zone, but you've always heard that creating ability groups for your reading programs or for other things is wise, then maybe you have some cognitive dissonance going on. And that is exactly what should happen over the course of the rest of the research reveal. Mike Schmoker has a really powerful quote. He says, the value of data is not in the questions, or not in the answers that it gives us. It's in the questions that it makes us ask. And that is the value of this data. John never intended this research to be a narrative of do this, don't do this, or only do those things that have double or triple the effect on student learning. He very much intended this research to ask questions, to open up a thinking process and an inquiry process that helps us dive into what do these effect sizes mean, what does the research underneath it say, and to hear that story behind the numbers. So is anyone interested in hearing a little bit of the story behind the numbers? Excellent, glad to hear that. So, with that said, any one of the 150 practices, the effect size is the average between a distribution of the scores. So you could be looking here at one effect that has a lot of scores within the blue zone, some in the green, some in the yellow, some in the red, and then the effect size is the aggregate between them, okay? Now, there's one practice of the 150 that has no achievement scores in the blue, no achievement scores in the green, and no achievement scores in the yellow. In fact, the more that John collects on this particular practice, the more it comes back to the red every single time. Anyone have any idea what that practice is? Well, that's good because I want to teach you. The other thing that I want to share with you right here is this. If you look at point 4 being the hinge point, and if you look at that being our moral imperative, or 1 year's growth over 1 year time, the biggest hope, the best message in the visible learning research is nearly everything that is above a 0.4 effect is directly within your control and within your influence. And that is a message that a lot of people don't share when they share this research. But if you look at the practices that double and triple the speed of learning, they are dependent upon an inspired and passionate teacher, and that educator is you. Meaning, our students can come to school with all kinds of problems, all kinds of issues that, yes, we take very seriously and we learn how to address, such as poverty, such as not having the ability to speak the language in which we school, such as having no parents in the home, whatever the case is. But those are challenges that this research tells us that you, the teacher, can overcome, and that the power of the teacher is more significant than anything else. What you do matters. It's backed up by Doug Reeves' 90-90-90 study. These were schools with 90% or higher poverty, 90% or higher English language learners, and 90% or higher proficiency in reading and mathematics on student achievement measures. Katie Haycock in Ed Trust, all of her work is about students who are at high risk and how the teacher is more important than any narrative they come to school with. And so when you look at the rest of these research results, I hope that it is empowering to you to know that what you do in your classroom every single day matters above anything else that these kids come to school with. So with that said, Hattie's research is also the most encompassing body of research. You may be familiar with a gentleman named Robert Marzano. Anyone ever heard of that guy? Yes. Oh, he was here. Oh, did he stand over here? No? Oh, in a different hotel. I got it. So Bob Marzano wrote a book called Classroom Instruction That Works, right? And it was an attempt to collect research and to power rank what a teacher does in the classroom and how much more effective one teaching strategy is over another. What's insanely good about the visible learning research is it's 150 practices initially on the curriculum, the student, the school, the home, the teacher, the learner. Okay? It is the most expansive body of research, not just about a few practices that the teacher employs in the classroom, but about what school is comprehensively, which is why John Hattie has earned the nickname Robert Marzano on steroids, because of how this research fits into all of these categories. So I'm going to teach you a little bit about how to read some of these league tables as I reveal some of this research to you. So the first thing about this is the rank. And the rank is where does it sit in the initial 150 practices? What is it, number 1 out of 150, 148, etc. The next piece is the actual influence, and that's the title of the initiative we implement. The next one is the number of studies, which helps you understand how many various studies fit within this one collection, within the massive collection. And then you have the effects. And the effects make the research incredibly thoughtful because the effects are what are the various aspects being studied. For example, if you look at homework, are we looking at homework with secondary boys who are English language learners? Are we looking at homework with primary girls? Are we looking at homework with middle level students who have IEPs? So the higher the effects, the higher you can be certain that the research is incredibly thoughtful. And then finally, we have what is called the effect size. And the effect size is the actual impact or score. So let's take a look at first what sits within that red zone. What are the total losers within the research? And here they are. Waterfall? All right. right, so the biggest loser in the research is mobility. And if you're keeping score, I just told you that those practices that yield immense student achievement are within your control and influence, so there's much hope in this research. And then you may be looking at number 150 and going, Kristin, you are a total liar, because mobility is out of my control. I can't help it if a student moves schools multiple times throughout the year. There's absolutely nothing I can do about that. Well, actually, what we have learned from the research is there is a lot that you can do to mitigate this negative impact of mobility. And one of those techniques is to make sure that students who are highly mobile are assigned a peer when they first enter the school, and that peer takes them through all of their classes. So if they're in the secondary, they have a very similar schedule. They go to the locker bay with them. They eat in the cafeteria with them. They make sure that that student is tended to every minute of their academic and social life over the course of their new journey within the school. Now, why does something like that help significantly mitigate the negative impact of mobility? Well, highly mobile children put up walls. So they're not wanting to learn because they don't think anything is permanent. They will move on to the next school, right? And so if they have a peer, all of the research goes to show that that peer actually helps them lower their walls, makes them more trustworthy and more ready to learn more quickly. So even though it's out of your control, it is not out of your influence. Now, what's the one that all of the teachers in the room hate on this list? I'm going to say summer vacation. I'm just going to guess because we all really like our summer vacation. And actually, there's nothing wrong with summer vacation as it is. We would love for you to take your summer vacation and rest and enjoy and relax. The idea with this is what happens to summer vacation and how long do we extend summer vacation by our teaching behaviors and habits. For example, what happens in the 2 to 4 weeks before summer vacation starts? Do we rigorously teach to all of the outcomes to ensure rigorous instruction every day up until summer vacation starts? Do we give a lot of end-of-year assessments? Do we have field days or whatever parties that we have for the end of the year? Maybe you have a week of movies because they all hit a theme you had over the course of the year. Whatever the case is, typically summer vacation is not the 2 to 3 months that we normally have summer vacation. We add a few weeks to it at the end of the year. And then at the beginning of the year, we don't get into rigorous teaching right away, do we? We're a lot about routines and procedures and get to know this person and whatever the case is, and that can add another couple of weeks to the school year as well. You can do all of those routines and procedures, by the way, and still rigorously teach the content at the same time. And so the tip here is don't overassess. Trust old data from 2 months before summer vacation started, and make sure you start the learning on day one and try to end the learning as late as possible into the school year to maximize and mitigate this effect. Make sense? All right, awesome. So remember how I told you that there's only one practice that is all red? There are no student achievement scores that show any kind of positive outcome or impact on student achievement whatsoever for this one practice. It's retention. Retention, or holding students back one grade level, actually has a negative impact no matter how many studies John adds. And the reason behind this is fairly simple. It fits Einstein's definition of insanity. What is it? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, right? Same teacher, same curriculum, same outcome again. Doesn't tend to do a whole lot for the learners in moving them forward. All right, so those were the losers. We're out of the red zone. We're going into what works, maybe not what works best, but things that actually have a beating heart effect. And before I move from the red zone, I'd like to ask you to turn and tell a neighbor any surprises here or any lessons, learnings, takeaways from the losers. Waterfall? All right. So now we will move into the yellow zone. And these are the practices that help learners get about that effect of a little bit of growth over a year's time to less than a half year's growth over a year's time. And which one on this list do you think secondary teachers absolutely hate? Teacher subject matter knowledge typically comes to the top, right? A 0.09 effect size. And why in the world, when we send teachers to school to get years of education in particular content areas, do we say then in this research, do you think that teacher subject matter knowledge barely has any kind of effect? What is the disconnect here? Well, the answer turns out to be fairly interesting. How many of you have ever had a teacher? I'm sorry, I'm trying to find the right place on the stage to stand because I'm getting a lot of reverb from the microphone, so I'm sorry if you're hearing weird stuff. But have you ever had that teacher that loves their subject matter knowledge so much that they do not care if you learn it? They could teach you forever and ever about the properties of chemistry, and 2 minutes into their lecture, you are gone, right? That is what we're talking about when it comes to teacher subject matter knowledge. Teachers privileging their content and their love for their content over pedagogy that doubles or triples the speed of learning. Now, what John wants everybody to understand with this is it's not at all as though we're saying subject matter knowledge is not important, which is why we need to learn the story behind these numbers. Because when we use feedback and when we use formative assessment and when we use classroom discussion, when we engage in those practices that double and triple the speed of learning, and then we have deep subject matter knowledge, we can take kids to places we never thought we could take them before. It's a matter of not only privileging that learning. All right? So moving on to the next set, we are in the green zone. And what I would like to highlight in this green zone is homework. Homework has a 0.29 effect size, okay? 3/4 of a year growth over a year's time. Now, what's interesting about homework is homework introduces what we call a moderating effect in the research. And a moderating effect is when there are two groups that are statistically different enough that we call them out, and then the effect size assigned overall is the average between those two groups. So in this instance, homework in the elementary or the primary has a much different effect than homework in the secondary. Much different. Looking at almost a 1.5 year growth over a year's time versus less than a half year's growth over a year's time. Turn and tell a neighbor, why do you think elementary homework has such a low effect? Or why do you think secondary homework has such a high effect? You could take it one way or another. Waterfall. So one question that I have is, who does the homework in the elementary? Parents, how many of you have ever had one of those elementary students, AKA children, in your life? You have your own child, yeah? Any of you ever been tempted to help do the homework for your elementary student for one reason or another? Absolutely. And what is the type of homework that most elementary children are sent home with? Projects. Yeah? Projects. Did you know that there's actually a website called Science Fair Projects for Parents, by the way? If you're ever wanting to show out in a pretty extraordinary way, just go to that site. It will blow your mind. But nevertheless, project-based homework has nowhere near the effect as homework that is meant to be deliberate practice on outcomes mastered ideally for that day. So there are 4 attributes that the research shows us that homework that yields a great impact on student achievement has. Would you want to know those 4 qualities of homework that yields that much more high impact? All right, well, I'm going to tell them to you. So here we go. All right, I love it. So number 1, homework that yields a high impact knows that quantity does not matter. You can get the same impact on student achievement with 5 problems as you can with 50 problems. Quantity does not matter. So just because we feel like the student must be obligated to complete all of the problems on the page, that the research tells us no, that is not a thing. All right, so number 2, time also doesn't matter. When it comes to impacting student achievement, 5 minutes is just as effective as 50 minutes. This is fascinating to me because where my children go to school, they have a rule of the minutes of homework based on their age. So if you are in 3rd grade, you get 30 minutes. If you're in 5th grade, you get 50 minutes. So my son just started 7th grade. He gets 70 minutes a night. And my daughter just started 9th grade, and she gets 90 minutes a night. Do you know, exactly, for God's sake, that is, yes. And do you know what's amazing about that is the majority of it is junk. The majority of it is junk because teachers are trying to fill the time obligation. And so we know time doesn't matter. What does matter? Number 3, homework that makes an impact is about outcomes and skills that kids have already had a chance to have some sort of proficiency with in the classroom. Homework that introduces new learning concepts is actually an equity issue. When we send kids home who do not have access to human resources or to physical resources to help them explore new content, we immediately set them at a disadvantage. And the purpose of homework is actually that it is deliberate practice. It is supposed to put the nail in the coffin in terms of you were in school, you were supposed to work on this outcome or this skill to get a level of proficiency, and then you go home and you take on a few problems to deliberately practice that skill or proficiency to take that knowledge from surface acquiring to surface consolidating. So the point of homework is to have that practice that etches it in our long-term memory as opposed to just our short-term memory. And then number 4, homework that yields a high effect receives immediate feedback. Very next class period, very next time that content is being addressed, immediate feedback. Now that feedback does not have to be from the teacher. That can be peer feedback, or that can be self-regulated feedback based off of work examples. But that feedback needs to happen nonetheless. So as you look at this and you think about how homework can have disparate effects from project-based, a student not owning it and not having those 4 requirements, all the way through homework that has those requirements, my question to you is, what does that mean for you and your homework program in your school, in your classroom? Is your homework getting the effect of a 0.15? Is your homework getting the effect of a 0.64? Are you somewhere in the middle, and what do you want to do about it? There are schools all over the world that are having this very type of conversation. I was just in Australia, and I had an elementary principal stand up, and the principal said, you know what? The way we're doing homework right now in this building, I can guarantee you we're getting a 0.15 effect. You work really hard and we're doing all the wrong things. So we have two choices. Do we want to completely overhaul our homework program to take all that hard work and actually make an impact and make it meaningful? Or do we want to throw out homework altogether and focus our time and energy on something that would really double or triple the speed of learning? And that is reflective of the types of conversations that we want to be having around this research. The only answer that is right is the answer that works best for you in your search for answers to your questions and in alignment with your goals and outcomes for your classroom and for your students. Make sense? This is one that I love. I'm not exactly sure how much time I have since we started late. Do you have 5 minutes? Is that okay? Okay, good. I'm sorry to keep you 5 additional minutes. I hope that's okay. So with this 0.41 effect, we're in the blue zone, and the one I want to hit on is quality of teaching as perceived by the student. This is where the student assesses, is my teacher a professional? Does my teacher care about me? Is my teacher dedicated to their craft, to their practice? Do they always want to become a better version of themselves for me? This research goes to show that what students think really matters. Their perception of us deeply matters, as a matter of fact. Russ Qualia has written a beautiful book on this concept called Student Voice. I see some heads nodding. You're familiar with his research. And just to call out 30 years plus of research on student voice in schools has shown that 43% of students around the world think school is boring. And if I think school is boring, I think it's not engaging, and I think that my teacher creates a boring environment on purpose. Therefore, my perception of them is not so great. And 38% of them think that their classes actually help them understand what's happening in their everyday life. Do you know another one to add to this is 48% of all students think that their teacher cares if they come to school or not. So 1 in every 2 kids thinks their teacher doesn't care if they come to school or not. So the question is, if we know that student perception of their teacher is in that blue zone and it matters, what are you doing to collect your students' voice to ascertain what they think about the learning and the teaching and about your practice and how it's unfolding in your classroom? Do we take the time, not just with an obligatory survey that our school gives, but with live-time data to collect their voice to determine what their perception is of what's happening? The one thing I will caution you on is if you choose to do something where you are collecting student voice more formatively, and you are really using it to try to see what's going on in your classroom, Russ Qualia tells us the worst thing we can do is collect student voice and then do nothing about it. If you're going to start the process, start by collecting the voice and then help students understand what you learned, what the patterns were, and some changes that you are going to make in order to change the narrative. And if you're not prepared to do that, he says don't even collect the voice in the first place. Because at first, when you invite the invitation for students to tell you what they think, the floodgates will open. Every child wants to be heard and be heard deeply. But over time, if you do nothing about it, they will close instantly and they will not give to you as you would want. So, and nothing can damage that teacher-student relationship more. So what I'd like to do right now is just give you a little taster of what currently sits at the top of the research. These are the practices that double, that triple the speed of learning, and the ones that we probably all have more curiosity about. The session this afternoon, that is a continuance of this session, will focus on some of these items that sit at the very top, and then tomorrow we're going to focus solely on teacher collective efficacy. And so I hope I hope that you were able to learn a little something new about this research and methodology, and then if you want to unpack any of these practices, I look forward to seeing you in future sessions. But the biggest thing I want to leave you with is this. There is nothing worse in any profession than not knowing if what we do has an impact and if what we do matters. I was recently reading an opinion piece in the Washington Post by a teacher in Washington, D.C. public schools who was leaving the profession after 10 years. And she wrote in her opinion piece, she said, I did everything over the course of these 10 years. I was super teacher, right? I went to all the PD. I tried every new strategy, every new practice. I stayed late. I gave up my summers. I did everything I possibly could. And she goes, and why am I leaving the field? Because I don't know if any of it mattered or if any of it made an impact. And as human beings, we almost wither at the notion of not knowing that what we do on a daily basis, let alone 10 years, makes an impact on the people that we influence and on our practice in general. And John's whole desire and notion behind this research was, do we know the impact of the practices we implement, and do we know our impact and that impact that it has on the learners? Because life is way too short to walk around guessing, spraying and praying, and trying everything we possibly can to move student achievement. We no longer have to do that. So thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your conference.